You know, this probably won't be that big of a surprise to anyone who's at all familiar with me, but just in case it wasn't already obvious, let me just say that I absolutely love platformers. Yeah, it almost goes without saying, but platformers are among my absolute favorite types of games. How could they not be? I mean, they've basically been the biggest part of my entire gaming life. From the early days of Alex Kidd, Sonic the Hedgehog, and of course Mario, to the later days of Crash Bandicoot, Jak and Daxter, and again Mario, these games have always held a very special place in my heart. That said, I have to admit that they're not necessarily the most unique games out there. Don't get me wrong, there obviously are some differences between most of these games and the quality of them can vary greatly, but in terms of unique gameplay elements and features, you could be forgiven for not necessarily seeing the major differences. That's where our subject for today comes in. With a slightly different objective than usual and some truly unique mechanics, these games definitely stand out, but is that for the better, or are they more like the sore thumb of the genre? Well, let's find out as we monkey around with the Ape Escape Trilogy. Now this should be fun! These games just have so many interesting aspects and fun ideas that even if you don't particularly like them, there's still quite a bit about them to admire and respect. I mean, they're not exactly your run-of-the-mill everyday platformers, are they? Before we go any further though, I know what some of you may be thinking. What fucking trilogy? Am I just going to ignore the Ape Academy games, the PSP remake, and all the various spin-offs and such? Yeah, pretty much. Okay, so technically this isn't really a trilogy, but I've always viewed it as such. I mean, none of the spin-offs really tie in all that much to the main games, and several of them weren't even released outside of Japan anyway. Maybe I'll give them all a look at some other time, but for now, I'm only going to focus on the main games. In any case, there's still a fair amount to talk about here, so let's not waste any more time. Let's just start at the beginning with Ape Escape for the PlayStation. The first thing we need to address here is the thing that makes this game and consequently the whole series so unique. Its rather unusual control scheme. You see, this was actually the very first game to require a dual analog controller. The reason for this is quite simple. You need a dual analog controller because you need two analog sticks. One to control your character and the other to control your gadgets. Oh what, you thought the right stick was for the camera? Pfft, what sort of idiots would do that sort of thing? Oh alright, so this is a bit unconventional to say the least, but it actually works quite well. Using the right stick just makes your gadgets much more accurate and precise, as a simple button press wouldn't really be able to replicate the same level of control. That said, you might think that this whole thing is just a gimmick, that it's nothing but an excuse to sell more controllers, and although you have a point, I can't agree completely. Just try the PSP remake and you'll instantly understand why. It's the same basic game, but using the face buttons to operate your gadgets just doesn't work as well. It's far more restrictive. So yeah, the control scheme may be a bit of a gimmick, but it's a gimmick that actually works and makes sense. Why does that sound so weird? Well, to be completely honest, the controls aren't flawless. Oh, don't get me wrong, this whole analog stick-based setup does allow for a fair amount of freedom in terms of your aim and such, but at times it can be a teeny bit difficult to be quite as accurate as you'd like. It usually works brilliantly, but yeah, you'll probably miss a few shots once in a while, especially in some of the more hectic situations. Either way, what exactly will you be using these somewhat unusual controls for? Well, the title is a bit of a hint, as the goal of the game is to, you guessed it, hunt down and capture a bunch of apes that escaped from some local monkey park. You do this by utilizing an increasingly large array of gadgets, including a slingshot that can hit distant objects, a propeller for reaching higher or more distant areas, and the monkey net for actually capturing the apes. Now, you might be wondering how you can have all these different gadgets considering there's only so many buttons on the controller, and the solution is actually rather neat. Like I mentioned, the right analog stick is used to actually operate the gadgets, while the face buttons are used to select them. This works well enough, but you probably managed to figure out that this also means that you'll only be able to have 4 gadgets equipped at any one time. In order to change your loadout, you have to go into the Gadget Select menu and press one of the face buttons to assign the selected gadget to that button. While there's not really anything wrong with this, I do have to admit that it can get a little annoying having to go in and out of this menu every few minutes. Granted, how often you actually use this screen does depend a bit on how you personally choose to equip yourself, but it's a fair bet that you'll be doing this quite a lot either way, especially as the amount of gadgets you have and need start to increase. Still, all of these gadgets are pretty inventive, they all work well, and they're all really fun to use, so it's not like a minor niggle like this really ruins anything. What may be a bit of a distraction for some though is the rather strange storyline and the downright awful voice acting. Like I said, the goal of the game is to capture a bunch of mischievous monkeys, but I didn't really explain why you have to do this. You see, the game starts with a white monkey named Specter somehow obtaining and putting on an experimental helmet called a peak point helmet, created by a professor ingeniously named the Professor. In any case, the peak point helmet is designed to increase the wearer's intelligence, which in Specter's case it does, but it also turns him evil. After giving more of these helmets to the rest of the apes in the park, Specter sets them all loose and uses them to take over the Professor's lab, where he and his assistant Katie happens to be in the process of creating a time machine. Yeah, I think you can see where this is going. As our hero, Spike, and his friend Buzz arrives at the Professor's lab to check out the time machine, Specter activates it, sending him, his army of monkeys, as well as Spike and Buzz backwards through time. Specter plans to use this opportunity to rewrite history so that apes become the dominant species, so it's up to Spike to stop him and save the world. Because as we all know, when the world and its history is about to be bent over a spoon by a hyper-intelligent and relatively dangerous race of super monkeys, the only thing to do is to let a 10-year-old boy handle things. That doesn't sound right. Yeah, okay, so obviously you're not supposed to think too much about this or take any of it all that seriously, but still, this storyline is pretty far-fetched to say the least. I guess it's decent enough though, especially considering the type of game this is. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said about the voiceovers, which are just downright dreadful. Actually, I guess that depends a bit on which version of the game you're playing. No, I'm not just talking about the obvious difference between an original Japanese and an English translated dub here, because you see, this game actually has both an American dub and a European/British dub. No, really, they actually made two different English dubs for this game and its sequels. I don't think I've ever heard of this being done before, and I actually didn't even know about it until I started working on this video. I mean, what's the point? It's the same language. Yeah, okay, so they're slightly different, but I'm pretty certain most English-speaking people understand both just fine. This is just pointless. In any case, both of these dubs are pretty bad, but if I had to choose one, I'd probably go with the European version. Again, neither version really work all that well, but if anything, the British voices do seem to fit a bit more, and I think the actors put just the teeniest bit more effort and emotion into their lines. On top of that, the European version has the far better version of Specter. I guess he sounds okay in the American version as well, but something about his voice is just a bit off. I can't tell if he's actually serious or not.
That's right. Apes will soon rule the world, just as it should have been from the beginning.
Are you being sarcastic, dude?
I don't even know anymore.
The British Specter just sounds so much better. Seriously, he sounds like Tim Curry or something.
My name is Specter. I'm the conqueror of the new Earth, and
I'm just a sweet transvestite.
Like I said though, none of these dubs are really all that good. Yes, Specter's European voice is enjoyable enough, but the rest are pretty forgettable at best and just downright awful at worst. Still, I guess they're okay for this type of game, considering they're not exactly the most important aspect here. No, the main reason anyone would pick up this game would be for the gameplay, and luckily for us, it's a fucking blast. Seriously, if you can't enjoy at least some parts of this game, then you're just weird. As previously mentioned, the main objective here is to hunt down and capture a specific amount of apes in each level, but that is far from all you do. As is fairly standard in these games, there are also a fair amount of hostile creatures to attend with, as well as several items to collect. You'll also have to solve various puzzles every once in a while, ranging from incredibly easy to not quite so easy. All of this probably sounds relatively familiar to anyone who's ever played a platform game before, and that's because it should be. There's not really anything about these mechanics that in and of themselves are all that unique, but the way they're coupled together with the control system and all the various gadgets make it all seem pretty fresh nonetheless. The enemies may not be the most intriguing creatures I've ever seen either, at least not for the most part, but they all serve their purpose well enough, and they do seem to fit in perfectly to the game's setting and style. Besides, you will occasionally come across a few enemies that will definitely challenge you a bit more than usual, and or that simply stand out from the others, so it's not like there's no variety or anything. The weirdest part about the enemy creatures is probably that this game doesn't really have any sort of boss fights. Okay, so you do have a final boss at the end of the game, 2 if you count the after credits extra final boss, but other than that, you don't really get any at all. Oh, there are certain fights that feel almost like boss encounters, but they're not really structured as such. I mean, you'll mostly come across and handle them in pretty much the same way as any other enemy, so no, I wouldn't really classify them as boss fights either. Ultimately, this may seem a bit weird, but as the whole game is really just building up to the final confrontation with Specter, I for one think this works brilliantly. I just don't think it would work quite as well if you suddenly had to fight some random caveman or something. Unless it was one of the Geico cavemen, because they deserve a punch in the face. Fair enough, they could have used a few of the monkeys you hunt down as bosses, which I guess they actually kinda do at times, but again, I just don't think the standard formula of fighting a boss after a set amount of levels would have worked that well here. It's just not structured that way. I guess we do get the confrontations with Buzz though, but they feel more like a bonus stage than anything else. You see, at 2 points in the games, yes, just 2, you will have to face off against Buzz, who's being controlled by Specter. These challenges aren't really battles though, they're more like a race. In fact, that's exactly what they are. No, really, the objective of these stages is simply to make it through an obstacle course and reach the goal before Buzz. There's nothing all that wrong with this, I guess, but I have to admit, it's nothing all that exciting either. As a matter of fact, it can actually be a bit frustrating as the margin for error is fairly small here. If you fuck up for more than like a second or two, you're pretty much guaranteed to lose, although these stages are still easy enough that you probably won't fuck up that much anyway. Another thing to mention is the fact that they actually tried to give most of the monkeys here their own unique personalities. They didn't just make them all monkey see, monkey do. Hey, I don't see you coming up with anything better. In all seriousness though, all of the monkeys actually have their own names, their own mannerisms, and their own tactics and styles. Okay, so a fair amount of them are pretty much just copy-pasted versions of other monkeys as well, but the variety and personalities of them are still pretty impressive. This can also impact the gameplay at times. For instance, certain monkeys are more timid and will try to hide from you, while others are more aggressive and prone to attacks. As such, you'll have to utilize different tactics for different monkeys, which only makes the game feel all the more varied and appealing. As for the items on offer, they're all pretty standard fare. You have these golden triangles or energy chips that are sort of like the coins in Mario. Collect 100 of them and you gain an extra life. Then there are the cookies that act as your health, and the various bullet types for your slingshot, explosive and guided. You can also find these shirts that represent an extra life, and finally we have the so-called Specter Coins. What exactly do the Specter Coins do? Well, they are used to unlock the minigames, all of which I rather like. Okay, so I wouldn't call them masterpieces or anything, but they're fun enough to play for a few minutes every once in a while, and I think using these special coins to unlock them is as good a way to go about it as anything else. Fine, these minigames may be a bit gimmicky in that they're all based around somehow using both the analog sticks, but for the most part they're more than acceptable. In addition, they all have a 2-player mode as well, which in my opinion only makes them that much more enjoyable. In any case, this game was a pretty big hit, and rightfully so. As such, a sequel had to be made, and 4 years later, that's exactly what we got, with Ape Escape 2. Ape Electric Boogaloo. Okay, no, it's not called that, but you know it should have been. Like the original game, this one is pretty excellent too, but I have to admit, I don't feel like there's quite as much to talk about here. Oh, there are some things worth mentioning, but mostly it's just a case of been there, done that. I still think it's a great game, it just doesn't really add that many new elements. A pretty obvious change though is in the cast. Katie, or Natsumi as she's now called, is back along with the professor, but their voice actors are not. Personally, I think Natsumi's voice is a bit better, but I'm not quite sold on the professor's. Don't get me wrong, it's decent enough, but I think I prefer the original a bit more. Our main character has also changed, as we're no longer controlling Spike. No, this time around we get to play as Hikaru, who's apparently Spike's 9-year-old cousin. Apart from some minor physical alterations though, he's pretty much the same character. No, really, the biggest or at least most obvious difference between Spike and Hikaru seems to be that Hikaru actually has a band-aid instead of a nose. No, I don't know what that's all about either. Maybe his nose was bitten off by one of the monkeys, or maybe he's just a huge Michael Jackson fan, I don't know. In addition to that, we also get a cute little sidekick named Peppochi, a baby monkey that Hikaru carries around on his head and that sometimes provides him with a bit of a helping hand. For instance, if Hikaru jumps a bit short of a ledge, Peppochi will give him an extra little lift, and he'll also give him an extra cookie if he runs out. The biggest cost change though is probably in the villains, and yes, I did say villains, as in more than one. Predictably, Specter is back, but sadly, oh so sadly, his curry-like voice isn't. Okay, so I guess his new voice is tolerable, but yeah, that's pretty much all it is. Seriously, he just sounds like a petulant and annoying child. You just want to slap him. I guess that could be what they were going for though, so you could argue it at least works on some levels. Either way, we do also get a few other villains this time, as Specter actually brought along a few friends. These guys are known as the Freaky Monkey 5, and they act as the game's boss fights. That's right, the big change this time around is the inclusion of boss fights. Basically, the only thing they could think to add here was something that most other platformers already had to begin with. Yeah, not quite as original this time around, are we? Now, to be fair, there's nothing wrong with boss fights. Hell, you might even argue that it just feels wrong not to have them in this sort of game, and I definitely think there's something to that. Besides, these guys are just so much fun and pretty damn memorable. The Freaky Monkey 5 are, well, just that, 5 freaky monkeys. They all have their different personalities, designs, and strategies, and they're each named after a particular color. Blue, yellow, pink, white, and red. Like I said, these guys are all fun and memorable, and the fights with them help break up the monotony and keep the game fresh and interesting. I particularly love Yellow Monkey just because of how fucking weird he is. I mean, just look at him. Not only is he a fairly large chap, but he dresses like some overly excited kabuki sumo wrestler or something, and the way he moves about and touches himself is just freaky. Also, what the hell is up with his eyes? Did he just snort the biggest line of cocaine in the world or something? I mean, he never blinks or anything. He constantly has that piercing, spaced out stare no matter what. On top of all of that, this guy is supposed to be male, but considering the way he acts and talks, you wouldn't really be blamed for thinking otherwise. Seriously, this is probably the one and only time I've ever come across an actual transvestite character in a video game, at least as far as kids' games are concerned. Yeah, I know, they don't specifically say anything about this guy actually being a cross-dresser or anything, but come on, we all know what's going on here. They might as well have gone full out and put him in a dress or something. You're not fooling anyone. Either way, I love this guy, if for no other reason than the fact that he's such a strange character. The rest of the Freaky Five are pretty fun too, and they only help give the game its own unique identity and make the overall experience that much more enjoyable and memorable. That said, why exactly are you fighting these guys anyway? Well, it all starts when Hikaru accidentally transports a load of the professor's monkey helmet, along with some special pants, to the monkey park using a so-called transporter. This means that Specter once again turns evil and sends his monkey army out to wreak havoc around the world. Now, as silly and nonsensical as this may be, it's all well and good for this type of game. That said, it doesn't work quite as well as the original game's storyline. Don't get me wrong, the original game wasn't exactly flawless either, but I do feel like the threat was a bit graver, and you could sort of explain why Spike would be the one tasked with fixing that situation, considering he was already lost in time and all. In this game though, the apes are just running wild around the world. Okay, so Spectre does have a plan to turn the human race into a lazy bunch of non-caring slobs with his so-called lethargy laser, making it relatively easy for him to seize control, but still, why would you send a 9-year-old boy to handle this?
Because you messed things up.
Yeah, okay, I guess he did, but still, wouldn't it be better to just send in the military or something?
You messed things up.
Yeah, I get that, but come on, he's just a little kid. It doesn't really seem safe to send him in alone.
You messed things up.
You're just trying to get rid of him, aren't you?
Very good.
You're a horrible person. Apart from that, the only thing left worth mentioning is probably the reward system. Unlike the original where you could collect Specter Coins in order to unlock 3 minigames, this game gives you loads of various unlockables, ranging from concept art and comic strips to extra lives and of course minigames. This is all well and good, but I don't really like the way you actually unlock these things. You see, this time around, they decided to just use regular gold coins for the unlockables. As you make your way through the levels, you can and probably will collect a fair amount of these coins, which can then be used in the hub or travel station at the so-called gotcha box. This probably sounds alright, and in reality it's not all that bad, but it just feels like such busy work. The thing is that the gotcha box only accepts 10 coins at a time. Once it's filled up, you have to hit it in order to make it release an item ball, which you then have to bust open to reveal your prize. Basically, it's just a random draw where you have absolutely no control over the outcome, so why do you need to go through this drawn out and relatively boring process each and every time? This bullshit just feels so tedious, and at times it almost grinds the game to a complete halt. All in all though, this is still a pretty excellent game, but apart from some relatively minor additions like a few new gadgets and the fun new bosses, it's pretty much just same old same old. With the next installment though, they really change things up. Well, apart from with the name, I guess, which is still just Ape Escape. Only with a 3 at the end this time. Because, you know, it's the third game. Yeah, let's just move on. Like I said, this game isn't quite the same as the others. Don't get me wrong, it's still basically the same kind of thing, but you'll notice quite a few changes and additions from pretty much the very beginning of the game. To start off with, the cast has once again changed, only this time it's a much bigger change than before. In fact, the only cast members that return are Spectre and the Freaky Monkey 5, although Natsumi, the Professor, Spike and Hikaru do make a very, very brief cameo. Either way, our new cast consists of Eiki, Sayaka and Satoru. Eiki is Sayaka and Satoru's aunt and pretty much acts as this game's substitute for Natsumi, giving advice to, training and guiding our heroes through the game. Now, if you paid attention, you should have noticed that I said heroes, and that's because we do actually have 2 hero characters this time, Sayaka and Satoru. There's not all that much difference between the two, at least not from a gameplay perspective, but it is nice to finally have the option to play as a girl as well. I know I, for one, have always wanted to be a little girl. Why don't you just forget I said that? In all seriousness though, having a choice of characters is always a welcomed addition, even if that choice has little to no bearing on the actual game. It is a bit of a shame that they didn't add some sort of 2-player and/or co-op mode though, as I think that could have been really fun, but I guess it wasn't absolutely necessary either. In addition to these characters, we also get a new villain named Dr. Tamuki, a fairly flamboyant scientist who assists Specter in his pursuit for world domination. Why he dresses like a wind-up disco ace of spade, I don't know, but he does seem kinda familiar.
Disco Stew is working pro bono.
So what exactly is Specter up to this time around? Well, apparently he and Dr. Tamuki have set up a series of TV stations around the world in order to broadcast a special program that will put anyone who watches it into a zombie-like trance. Isn't that what most TV shows do anyway? Again, you're obviously not supposed to think too much about this as it's just a silly kids game storyline, but still, no part of this really makes any sense. For instance, we're supposed to believe that pretty much the entire world is under this show's spell, which is why Sayaka and Satoru are the only ones who can fix things, but come on! You're really telling me that the entire freaking world will not only have their faces glued to the screen, but that they would all be tuned into this one program at once? I don't know about you, but to me, that just seems rather unlikely. In all fairness though, this is meant to be pretty goofy, and as far as kid-friendly platform games go, it's more than acceptable. Yeah, it's silly, really silly, but I'm pretty sure that's exactly what they were going for. Unfortunately, to maintain this whole TV theme the game is going for, the enemy creatures aren't quite as interesting and varied as in the previous games. No, really, the other games had everything from regular old bats to fire-breathing pig tanks. That's a pretty varied and interesting enemies list in my opinion. So what does this game have to offer us? Robots! Just robots. Exciting, huh? Okay, so there's nothing all that wrong with these robots, or teleborgs as they're called, and there are some variations, but I don't think there's much doubt that the previous enemies were much more interesting. Okay, so I guess it is pretty difficult to come up with something quite as unique as a poo pig, but still, a little effort would be nice. Like I said though, the teleborgs do at least fit the overall style and theme of the game, they're just not all that memorable. Something I don't think you'll forget quite as easily though is the all-new Persona system, and no, it doesn't have anything to do with the Shin Megami Tensei series. The thing is that this game doesn't actually have any new gadgets. In fact, it has even fewer gadgets than either of the previous games, which is where the Personas come in. Basically, these are a series of costumes your character can morph into that all grant various abilities. For instance, the Fantasy Knight gives you more strength and can withstand fire, and the Miracle Ninja can run along ropes and walls with footprints on them. Although it is a bit of a shame that you have relatively few gadgets this time around, these personas really do make up for it, and in spades. Not only do they kind of act as substitutes for some of the gadgets you would otherwise be using, but they also add another level of strategy to the game. Sometimes you may as well stick with the standard gadgets, while at other times the personas will be more useful or even required. You can't simply use the personas whenever you want though, as they require so-called morph energy. In order to transform, you need to have a full morph gauge, and once a persona is activated, this gauge will gradually deplete, changing you back to your normal form when it runs out or when you manually cancel the transformation. This morph energy is relatively easy to come by though, so keeping a full gauge isn't the most difficult thing in the world, especially considering it also refills over time. You can also purchase so-called morph stocks, which give you an extra bar's worth of energy, allowing you to transform more times in a row without the need to refill the gauge. Now, I did say you could buy the morph stocks, which brings me to the way this game handles the unlockable extras. You see, at the hub, or TV station, there's an area called Market Street. As the name suggests, this is basically a street full of shops where you can use the coins you collect in the various levels to purchase anything from cookies and extra lives to concept art and minigames. Do you see this, Ape Escape 2? Do you see? This is how you handle unlockables! You let me decide when and what to unlock. You don't just make it a tedious random draw. Now you go to the corner and you think about what you did. Shame on you! Seriously though, this is by far the best reward system in any of these games, as you have complete control over it. Maybe you'll want a few more extra lives, or maybe you want a new chassis for your remote control car, it's all up to you. Well, at least for the most part. You see, there are certain items you won't be able to unlock until you've cleared certain levels, but that's not really such a big deal. I mean, you still get to decide if you actually want to unlock them when they do become available, or if you prefer to buy something else, so all in all, this system is pretty damn brilliant. I also have to mention that the monkeys in this game sport a little bit more of a challenge, or at least they can. This time, they not only use various tactics to either hide from or attack you, but they can actually use some of your own gadgets against you by making you drop them. Most notably, they can capture you with a monkey net, which actually sends you back to the TV station. This can definitely be a bit annoying and frustrating, but I for one think it's a welcomed addition. Oh, don't get me wrong, it's not so much that the previous games were too easy or anything, but it just seems pretty fitting to me that these apes would do these sort of things if given the chance. Besides, this is relatively easy to avoid, so you probably won't deal with it all that much anyway. In addition to all this, they also decided to make the process of switching out gadgets even easier. While you can still use the gadget select screen like before, you now also have the option of just double tapping the button containing the gadget you want to change. This allows you to cycle through all of your available gadgets and lets you change your loadout on the fly without the need to go into any menus. True, there may be times when it's better to use the menu as that also pauses the game, but this is still a very handy little addition that only improves the overall enjoyment you'll most likely get out of the game. All in all, this is a spectacular addition to the series, especially considering all the various additions and improvements it brings to the table. That said, do any of these games really hold up all that well? No, they hold up fucking brilliantly! In all honesty, these are still some of the absolute best and most unique platformers money can buy. There's just a real sincere charm to each of them, and they're all pretty much impossible not to enjoy. Okay, so there are some niggles, like the voice acting isn't all that brilliant and the storylines are pretty ridiculous, but ultimately, none of the things that really matter are even remotely problematic. Well, okay, I guess the camera can actually be a bit cumbersome at times, but even that doesn't really ruin anything. The games look great, the music and sound effects are just about perfect, the various gadgets are all really fun and easy to use, the levels are amazingly well designed, and hunting down all these rambunctious monkeys is surprisingly enjoyable and rewarding. If you haven't already and you have the means to do so, you absolutely must get a hold of and try out all of these games. I guess Ape Escape 3 is the one to look for if you can't get them all, but it's honestly such a close call that I'm pretty sure any of them would make you very happy. They sure as hell made me happy! In fact, these games have made me so full of childlike joy that I think I need to calm myself down a bit with something a bit more mature and dramatic. Something like... oh, I don't know, an animated space opera from the 80s? Yeah, let's go with that.